So this is topic 5, and up to this point in the course, we've spent a couple of weeks reviewing some key macroeconomic issues as well as financial market issues. And when I'm talking about financial markets, I'm typically talking about debt markets and the interest rates in those debt markets. We'll talk a little bit about stock markets, but financial markets in the context of this course, mainly debt markets. So we did a couple of weeks on some fundamental issues in macroeconomics and financial markets. Then weeks 3 and 4, we had a look at debt markets, both short-term debt markets and long-term debt markets. What we're doing in this topic is we're introducing ourselves to different concepts in international macroeconomics, and this is where we'll start getting into some reasonably advanced concepts. And now that we've got the foundation knowledge there from the first 4 weeks, we can really start exploring what's going on in the Australian economy and what's going on in other economies around the world. But in this topic, before we do that, we need to understand some fundamentals about the global economy. And what I mean by the global economy is trade, foreign investment, and the relationship between those two. There is a key relationship between the amount a country trades, the amount of foreign investment that moves in and out of that country, that is inward foreign investment, so coming from overseas into Australia, and outward foreign investment coming from Australia to another country. So a fundamental relationship between trade and foreign investment flows. And we need to come to terms with that by doing a little bit of theory first. Once we do that, though, we can really start looking at what's going on in the world and look at the Australian economy, probably look at the German economy, the US economy, and a lot of others. So we'll start by section 5.1 here. I've just got 2 slides, and these slides talk about the main characteristics of the global economy. Now, in this course, I'm not overly interested in the characteristics of the global economy in terms of examining you in the final exam on those characteristics. So the information on this slide and this slide, I'm going to go through before we get to 5.2, which is a separate video. So the information on these first 2 slides is just background information for you. Some of you will already know this material, others it'll be new, but let's just consider this foundation knowledge in this video for the material that comes ahead, comes later in this topic, rather than material that you really need to go out and read widely about. So the main characteristics of the global economy. This is kind of the world we're in at the moment. Things have changed over the last sort of 20, 30 years dramatically. You probably haven't witnessed that firsthand. You've probably read about it a lot. But I think most of you are sort of 18, 19, 20 years old. Might be a few older people in the class, and that's fine. But for many of you, you would have been born in 2003, 2004, I'm guessing. And the global economy was already in place at that time. I guess with me being a little bit older, I've seen the changes, and they have been extraordinary. So in terms of globalization, we define globalization loosely in terms of increased global trade, as well as increased foreign investment, but then also greater communication through new technologies globally, greater people flow, particularly immigration into Australia and possibly out of other countries, and then transportation has become much easier as well. So these increased global trade, increased global investment, better communication, more immigration, more people moving around the world, and better transportation of goods and services via trade, all key features. And that's the world we're living in. So transportation, for example, in the last couple of decades, we've had companies building these massive bulk carriers, which can now transport far more iron ore, as an example, from Australia to Japan, Australia to China, than was possible previously. And so with these mega carriers, which are much bigger than the carriers they used to use 20, 30 years ago, that obviously lowers production costs and just speeds up the flow of iron ore, as an example. Communication, that means, or one of the obvious one of the obvious ways the world has changed in terms of communication is the medium I'm talking to you through, the medium I'm using to talk to you now. So Teams, Zooms, these days I have far more meetings with people overseas via Teams and Zoom than I did sort of 20, 25 years ago when that technology wasn't available. It was more sort of email communication 20, 25 years ago than sort of face-to-face communication over systems like this. And also these days, we're also at UWA, we're teaching overseas. We're teaching to people overseas through this sort of technology as well. So it's just brought up all sorts of different possibilities. And you could probably give me a dozen examples of your own. Now, what we'll be focusing on in this topic is international trade and foreign investment. Okay, so I've got a lot of things listed here, such as comparative advantage, economies of scale, increased competition, a lot of things that globalization have made possible. But I'm not going to labor the point. I'm not going to go through each of these. For this second point, for the first point, all I needed you to know is what are some of the key features of the global economy? What is globalization about? How do you kind of define it? That's that. This second one, international trade, and the third one, foreign investment, what I want you to take away from this slide is that there is now more international trade than there's ever been before in a wider range of goods and services are being traded, and it's far more easy to undertake trade in goods and services. Now, you know as well as I do, these days, a lot of what is produced is technology type products. And those products can be bought and sold electronically. So you can buy ebooks off Amazon these days, as an example. So that's what I mean by sort of international trade as it relates to globalism. There's more of it, it's far easier, and a greater array of goods and services are being produced and traded. And we're going to look at Australia's trade performance and the trade performance of some other countries in this topic, and really come to a far better understanding of what determines how much a country trades, what it trades, and its net trade position. So this is going to be very important later on in this topic. We will be interested to a large extent in net trade. That is defined as the total value of your exports from, let's say, from Australia to the rest of the world, minus the total value of your imports. So both total exports and total imports will be measured in Australian dollars, and the difference between those is called net exports, and it's a very important variable in economics and macroeconomics. And we'll come to a better understanding of what drives the level of net exports. In countries such as the United States, their level of net exports is negative, meaning that exports are less than imports. In countries such as Japan and Germany, their net exports value is positive, indicating that exports are greater than imports. So we need to come to an understanding of, well, why is that the case? And you may have some ideas, but I'm guessing that your understanding of that is only partially complete if you have any understanding at all of what determines the level of net exports in a country. So that's what we've got to work towards. And then the second one here, the second major characteristic of the global economy is foreign investment. Now, I've already mentioned that the three main asset classes that you can invest in are shares, bonds, and real estate. Yes, of course, there's other assets like gold and diamonds and all sorts of different assets, but shares in companies, bonds, and real estate are by far the three largest categories. So when we talk about foreign investment, we're not talking about investment spending in the sense that we use that word in the first two topics. So investment spending in macroeconomics is when a company goes out and buys a computer, buys a truck or a tractor or some other piece of capital equipment. Okay, that's investment spending. That is part of the aggregate demand curve. That type of investment spending directly produces GDP and it creates jobs. On this slide, I'm referring to foreign investment, and that's a very different usage of the word investment. What I mean by foreign investment is foreigners buying Australian bonds, shares, or real estate, or Australians buying foreign bonds, shares, and real estate. Of course, you can have foreign investment in another asset class other than those three. So, for example, you may have a Japanese company buying an Australian golf course. Now, it's not technically, I guess, it's not real. Well, is it real estate? Not in the typical sense of the word, because when you talk about real estate investment, most people think of houses and apartments and townhouses and things like that. So let's just say that a golf course is not real estate in the sense that we're using the term. You could have a foreigner coming in and buying a hotel, for example, or another type of asset. But most of the foreign investment money that moves in and out of Australia is chasing bonds and shares, and then real estate. Okay, so if you look at the data, by far it's bonds, shares, and real estate. So yeah, that's what I mean by foreign investment. I'm not talking about investment spending in the sense of the aggregate demand curve. I'm talking about money coming from one country to another and purchasing bonds, shares, and real estate. Now, those purchases of bonds, shares, or real estate may then cause the aggregate demand curve to move, but that's a separate issue. Okay, so for example, if a Japanese superannuation fund undertakes foreign investment in Australia by purchasing an Australian bond issued by Woodside, then Woodside may use that money to undertake investment expenditure to increase the capacity of one of its gas facilities. So that foreign investment in purchasing a bond by the Japanese superannuation fund may then result in investment spending, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right by Woodside. But you need to keep the two quite separate in your mind. Even though the foreign investment may lead to investment spending, acknowledge that, but keep them separate in your mind. And what we'll be doing in this topic is looking at the amount of foreign investment that comes into Australia, the amount of foreign investment that comes out of Australia, why those flows of foreign investment money in and out of Australia take place, and the impact they have on the level of international trade that we undertake. Because you may not realise it now, but one of the most powerful influences of the level of trade, that is exports and imports, that occurs in Australia, is the level of foreign investment. So these two, the amount of trade we do with the rest of the world and the amount of foreign investment that comes in and out of Australia, are fundamentally linked. And once you understand that relationship, it's very powerful, because then I'll be able to explain what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Germany, what's going on in Japan, in terms of their interaction with the rest of the world. And until we get the theory down, I would just be telling you stories that you wouldn't fully appreciate. Once we get the theory, then we start applying it. And I think you'll be quite surprised by the number of applications we can develop once we understand the relationship between international trade and foreign investment more fully. So let's go through the theory and the rest of this topic. There'll be a few little applications, but then in topic 6, we'll really start getting into the applications and learning about the relationship between foreign trade, foreign investment, et cetera, and then of course we'll link that back to domestic economies as well. So we're getting very close to the point where we're going to start exploring what's going on in the world. Of course, we've already been doing that, but we will really start getting into it soon. We've just had to build up some foundation knowledge first. So some of the benefits of the global economy, they should all be fairly obvious to you. Free trade, that's fairly obvious. Movement of labour, So in Australia, for example, we've been searching overseas for foreign doctors, nurses, engineers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's certainly a benefit of the global economy. Maybe not for the countries that we are attracting those people away from. That's always something that is in the back of my mind when the Australian government goes out looking for nurses and doctors and engineers from other countries. We are taking those skilled professionals away from other countries. So while it may benefit us, obviously it does benefit Australia, yeah, it may not necessarily benefit the countries that those people are leaving. But that's a side point, important, but a side point to the course. Increased economies of scale. That means, particularly in trade, Australian companies can now produce and sell to a much larger marketplace, a global marketplace, and also increased investment potentially as well. So sort of in the olden days, back 60, 70, 80 years ago, before any of us were born, a country was really restricted in terms of the amount of investment that it could undertake, restricted in the sense that that investment needed to be funded by its own domestic savings. These days, particularly in Australia's case, we fund our investment spending, okay? And now I'm talking about investment spending, the I, which is part of the aggregate demand curve. We fund that investment spending using not only Australian savings, but foreign savings as well. Okay, so a lot to learn in this particular topic. So I'll leave this video here and we'll move on to video 5.2. But just a reminder of what I said at the start of this video. These two slides are more about foundation knowledge about some of the key aspects of the global economy, rather than being indicative of important course content themselves. Certainly what we move on to in the next video and the video after that, that will become very, very important. But this, we're just laying the scene here. Globalization itself is not a big part of this course. Well, it's not really part of this course at all. The course is more about the global economy rather than the process of globalization. So what I mean by that is this course is about the global economy, how the Australian economy interacts with the rest of the world, and how that interaction affects the Australian economy and all Australians. So, and also in terms of investment flows, money moving in and out of Australia. How does foreign investment and foreign investment markets affect the Australian economy? So the course is more about sort of Australia's place in the global economy and how other countries influence what Australia experiences, rather than the process of globalization itself.